Welcome to Shakespeare Authorship Roundtable, where my mother, Barbara Crowley, started this group in 1985 with Carol Sue Lipman, who is still our president.
Welcome, everyone. So glad to see so many faces from so many places. Our speaker, Rima Greenhill, will be talking about her new book titled Shakespeare, Elizabeth and Ivan, The Role of English-Russian Relations in Love Labor's Lost. Rima is a longtime member and supporter of the Roundtable, and we're excited to hear about her new book. And Rima has made learning and teaching foreign languages her lifelong passion.
I really appreciate this invitation to speak. This is not my first time speaking with the Roundtable group, but it's so wonderful to see so many old friends and acquaintances and new people. So I'm really happy to be here. Thank you. As Carol Sue said, the subject of my talk is the Love Labor's Lost in the context of Russian-English relations. And that is the subject of my book, Shakespeare, Elizabeth and Ivan. In the book, I offer a previously unexplored interpretation of Love Labor's Lost, in which I link Shakespeare's characters and allusions in the play to real people in both Russian and English courts, and to actual incidents from the diplomatic and economic exchange between England, Russia, and the continental powers. I also explain why there are two plays within the play, and what does the Mask of Russians and Pageant of the Nine Worthies have to say to us, why the play is set in France, and how the relationship between Russia, England, and France form the canvas on which the play is drawn. So I will start by summarizing the main complaints about the play, as usually voiced by Shakespeare scholars. Then I will delve into the historical background, without which I believe it is impossible to make neither head nor tail of this very complex play. Then we will look at some citations from the play that I think best illustrate my points. And I hope that by the end of my talk, it will become apparent to you, just as it did to me over the many years that I worked on the play, just how much Shakespeare knew about Elizabethan foreign policy, about economics, about diplomacy, and about the world at large. So Love Labor's Lost has been seen for centuries as an enigma. Dover Wilson called it, I quote, an enigma of dramatic history. And it is certainly one of the most perplexing Shakespeare's plays. Numerous annotated editions and many scholarly studies have been written, and yet Love Labor's Lost still remains the subject of intense speculation and conjecture. So there are many issues that make this play difficult to interpret, more difficult perhaps than any other Shakespeare play. There are three major complaints that I will mention, and they're the ones that usually resurface when scholars talk about the play. The first one is the play's plot, or rather lack of it. There is little dramatic action as such in the play. The plot remains unresolved, and the ending is postponed for a year, or as Shakespeare puts it in the play, for 12 months and a day. And this ending is rather surprising, as the play was performed during the joyous Christmas season. Diego de Silva, a Spanish ambassador who was resident at Queen Elizabeth's court at one time, he noted that the comedies at court always ended in matrimony. And the reason for this, as Elizabeth herself explained to him, was to induce her to marry. Love Labor's Lost, as you know, is called a comedy but unlike other comedies, it does not end in marriage, nor does it have a happy ending, which we expect. And not only there is no encouragement to marry, but on the contrary, we have a gang of women who gain control over men. And that is the reason why many Shakespeare scholars, especially female scholars, they insist that Love's Labour's Lost is Shakespeare's most feminist play. The second thing that usually is brought up is that it is difficult to interpret the play because of the lack of known sources. The play is not based on one single source or any previous work. So that makes it harder to decide when and why it was written. But the greatest difficulty that everyone acknowledges is the third one, and this one lies in the play's language, in its linguistic complexity, because the play is just oversaturated with multi-level puns, distortions of Latin words and Latin expressions, but has tons of malapropism in it, contains turns of speech that have multiple meanings, and it is full of those enigmatic topical allusions that are very hard to decipher. No other work of Shakespeare's is so linguistically loaded and so linguistically rich. Language is definitely the main feature of the play and not its plot or its action. My interpretation is that the play closely mirrors actual comic and tragic events in Anglo-Russian relations, and that Shakespeare captured and immortalized in it much of a largely forgotten Tudor history. And if we see the play in this light, then the three problems that I mentioned, they seem to fade into something much more understandable. So we know that there are only 2 performances have been documented, only 2 performances on record, and one is sometime in the late 1590s, as the page of the first quarto illustrates. Then there was a performance in 1605, 1604 to 1605, the Christmas season, the first Christmas season of King James at court. So both performances took place at court. A lot of scholars, not most scholars, but many scholars believe that Love's Labour's Lost was written specifically for the court and not for the public theatre as such. And most scholars have accepted the traditional interpretation that this is Shakespeare's so-called French play. It is set in France. It has 5 male courtiers, their names very strongly associated with the names of personalities from the French Wars of Religion. So no one can argue with that. And then we have the Mask of Russians, for which this play is famous. And here, for the first time in Shakespeare, we come across Russians. Although this very strong Russian component, which the mask introduces, but in order to understand the real meaning of Love's Labour's Lost, we need to rediscover the captivating story of Russian-English relations in the second half of the 16th century. Because if we take the play at face value, it's nothing but a frivolous comedy of manners in which the appearance of these masquerading Russians can be very easily dismissed. However, I think a more accurate description of Love's Labour's Lost, I would say it is a very sophisticated Elizabethan romp, deeply concerned with current foreign affairs, international trade, and royal courtships. But I believe we need to pay more attention to it because the historical context in which he lived and wrote was a very exciting period. The 16th century was a great age of discovery, of distant voyages, and of commerce. Exploration on the English side was driven by the dismal state of the English economy, which was the result of several factors. One was Henry VIII's gross fiscal mismanagement. He left $1 million debt to his children to cope with. And then Queen Mary added another 30,000 that she borrowed from Antwerp merchants and so on. So that was one reason. The second reason was that it cost England a lot of money to keep itself independent of Spain. And then the third blow was the loss of Calais. And that dealt a devastating blow to the cloth industry, and cloth, woolen cloth, was the main item of English export at the time. So when the Elizabethan age began, England and Elizabeth desperately needed new markets. The main promoters of exploration and discovery were English merchants. They knew that England was lagging behind Spain and Portugal in exploration, and they wanted to join the race in order to get to those fabulous riches from the East. Among them were, of course, very expensive and much treasured spices, such as cinnamon, peppers, nutmeg, and they were needed to preserve meat and other foodstuff, and they were also used for medicinal purposes. So in 1550s, the isolation of two countries, Russia and England, that were situated on the periphery of Europe and might not never come together, but their isolation was broken and their aligned history began in 1553, because that year 3 ships set out from England in search of the northeast passage to China. 2 ships perished on the way, got frozen on the Scandinavian coast, but 1 ship survived, and accidentally, by pure accident, it ended on the shores of the White Sea in the Russian north, and thus began England's fateful encounter with Muscovy, because that's how Russia was called at the time. The leader of the expedition, Richard Chancellor, he managed to reach Moscow, took him about a month, but then he met and was extremely well received by the country's ruler. And that was Ivan IV, Ivan Grozny, who is nowadays known to history best as Ivan the Terrible. Ivan wasn't stupid. He immediately saw advantages of trade with England. And so he proceeded to grant the English unprecedented trading privileges. So no taxes of any sort, no fines, nothing. They could do whatever they want. But Ivan was surrounded by enemies on all sides, and he was constantly at war with his neighbors. So he desperately needed ships, he needed weapons, he needed various West European specialists. It would also benefit from Russia's raw materials. It would benefit from leather, wax, tallow, flax, hemp, and other goods. And it could find a very lucrative market for its woolen cloth, the Russian climate being what it was and is. So what followed was a 90-year-long Anglo-Russian exchange, which was comical and tragical at the same time. And the relationship was so intense, so bizarre, that Nikolai Bestuzhev-Ryumin, who was a 19th century Russian historiographer, who was asked by the current Tsar in the 19th century to put together a comprehensive history of Russia, Bestuzhev-Ryumin said that the Ivan-Elizabeth relationship, I quote, required someone of the caliber of Shakespeare to do it justice. And the Russian historian had no idea that Shakespeare took up this challenge a long time ago, and he weaved the story into the fabric of one of his comedies, Love Sleep Lost. So 2 years after initial contact in 1555, that year saw the formation of the Muscovy Company. And I'll show you its seal, which is in the British Library. The Muscovy Company was the very first limited liability company. Because of that, really, it became a foundation stone of what we know as modern capitalism. The Muscovy Company, for that time, for the time it was formed, was really remarkable. In its membership, what we had the English court and the English commerce overlapping, because over 10% of the founding members of the company were high-ranking courtiers. The list of the names of the members, and there were 201 of them, 199 men and 2 women. So her right-hand man, William Cecil, then her favorite, Robert Dudley, her spy master, Francis Walsingham, the treasurer, Christopher Hatton, at one time or another were actively involved in trade with Russia, and they had personal financial stakes in the failures or successes of the company's expeditions. Elizabeth herself was personally involved. She lent her own ships to the company. And at that time, because there was no distinction between Elizabeth's personal assets and that of the country's treasury, basically meant that she personally was enriched by every prosperous voyage that was made. So because of the navigation issues, bad weather conditions, the English envoys in Russia, as well as the Russian envoys that came to England, they had to stay in their respective countries for up to a year. And that gave the opportunity to both courts and the rulers of both countries to get to know each other. So the Queen and her court were familiar with the Russian envoys and their behavior, their customs, their expectations. They knew how Russian dressed, and the way they dressed always seemed very strange, very similar to the clothes in Turkey. And Turkey was considered to be very exotic, but also very barbaric. This is how Russians looked in 1576 when they went to Germany, and that's how they looked when they came to England as well. Trade with Russia or with any other country was the motivating force behind political alliances. It was often accompanied by marriage proposals. So we know quite a bit about Elizabeth's French and Austrian Habsburg marriage negotiations. They were very numerous, much less known about her Russian courtships. And Elizabeth welcomed to her court 5 Russian envoys. 4 came during Ivan the Terrible's reign, and 1 came during the reign of Boris Godunov. All of those visits involved marriage negotiations between the 2 countries. It wasn't easy from the very beginning to deal with Russia. The relationship was strained, exciting, but very strained from the very beginning. But when it got really exciting is when Ivan started thinking of marrying Elizabeth. And his advances to her began in 1567. They were carried to her court verbally by the first English ambassador to Russia, Anthony Jenkinson. Elizabeth avoided Ivan's matrimonial proposal for several years. She pretended that it must have been a mistake. She blamed Jenkinson, who did not speak Russian, for muddling the Tsar's words. She also put the blame on the translator that was present when Jenkinson was negotiating with Ivan. I believe that one very funny episode in Love's Labour's Lost during the Mask of Russians reflects that particular episode in Russian-English relations. So we have a passage in which a Boyer serves as a go-between the princess and the Russians that come to her court, to the court of Navarre. The exchange that takes place, as you can see, is rather dysfunctional. Rosaline pretends to be the princess. So as far as the mock Russians are concerned, they think that they're talking to the princess herself. They're pretending, the courtiers are pretending to be Russians. So Rosaline says, what would these strangers know their mind, Boyer, if they do speak our language? 'Tis our will that some plain men recount their purposes, know what they would. Boyer turns to the Russians. What would you with the princess? Biron replies, he's dressed as Russian, nothing but peace and gentle visitation. What would they say there? Asked Rosaline. Nothing but peace and gentle visitation, replies Boyer. Why, that they have, and bid them to be gone. She says, you have it, and you may be gone. King, as a Russian. Say to her, we have measured many miles to tread a measure with her on this grass. Boyer. They say they have measured many a mile to tread a measure with her on this grass. Rosaline. It is not so. Ask them, how many inches is in 1 mile? If they have measured many, the measure then of one is easily told. If you come hither, you have measured miles, and many miles. The princess bids you, tell how many inches does fill up 1 mile. Biron. Tell her we measure them by various steps. Boyer, she hears herself. Boyer had enough. He can't stand it any longer. Resigns his unnecessary appointment as an interpreter. So then the second round of Russian-English marriage negotiations, those of 1582, 1583, are also immortalized in Love's Labour's Lost. But by then, Ivan has been waiting for 15 fruitless years for Elizabeth to respond to his marriage proposal. Our wooing does not end like an old play. Jack has no Jill, complains Biron at the end of Love's Labour's Lost, and Ivan certainly did not have Elizabeth. Elizabeth's idea was not to agree to marry him, but to keep him hoping so as to keep the trade going. In the 1580s, Ivan found himself in rather difficult political and personal circumstances. In 1581, he lost the Baltic port of Narva, which he got in 1558. Then he also knew that the peace he recently concluded with Poland could not last for very long. It was just temporary. And on top of that, in November 1581, he inadvertently killed his older son when he got very angry with him. And in that fit of rage, he hit him with the metal pole that he always carried with him. This was immortalized by a wonderful Russian painter, Ilya Repin, great researcher of Russian history, and he was really taken by this horrible incident. What happened after that? The heir was dead. Ivan Ivanovich, the oldest Tsarevich, was dead now, and that left sickly, mentally deficient second son by the name of Fyodor Ivanovich. The second Tsarevich became the heir apparent. So in this tense climate of fear and paranoia, England beckoned to Ivan more than ever. He saw it as a kind of safe haven from his personal and political turmoil and wanted to unite himself with the English royal house. So he reached out to Elizabeth again, but now he was too embarrassed to ask her to marry him again. So he started inquiring if she had an unmarried female relative he could propose to. Elizabeth did not waste any time. That same year, 1581, through her doctor, Dr. Jacob, whom she sent to attend to Ivan, she suggested a different candidate. She suggested Lady Mary Hastings, who was the sister of Henry Hastings, the third Earl of Huntingdon. Lady Mary and Elizabeth were really very distant relatives, but Elizabeth presented her to Ivan as her niece. Well, Elizabeth's plan certainly worked. Ivan was smitten with the idea of Lady Mary as his wife number 8, and the new marriage negotiations were put in motion in May 1582. As his ambassador, Ivan chose Fyodor Pisimsky, one of the most experienced and ablest diplomat at the Russian court. Pisimsky was dispatched in the summer of 1582, and he reached England that September. So Pisimsky's task was to renew Ivan's request for a joint offensive-defensive political alliance. He was to request more weapons, more military supplies. Piłsudski was instructed by Ivan to meet and to observe Lady Mary Hastings very closely. Piłsudski was to bring back her portrait. Christopher Carlyle, who was Lord Admiral of the English Navy and who accompanied the Piłsudski party, he continued alone. He left them in their lodgings and he continued alone to report their safe arrival to the Queen. So Elizabeth received a warning of imminent arrival of the Russian envoys, just like the princess it does in Love's Labour's Lost, prior to the Mask of the Muscovites. So Boyer runs in to see the princess, and he runs in great excitement, and he shouts, "Prepare, madam, prepare! Arm, wenches, arm, in countess mounted against your peace. Love does approach disguised. Arm it in arguments, you'll be surprised. Master your wits, stand in your own defense, or hide your heads like cowards and fly hence." It's interesting that there is a mention of arms in this passage. Military vocabulary is featured here, and that's exactly what Elizabeth was supplying Ivan with. That was part of the trade bargain. Piłsudski's arrival caused enormous excitement at the English court. Edward Manners, the third Earl of Rutland, reported in one of his letters that there was, I quote, "much ado about the coming of the Emperor of Muscovy's ambassador." And we learned that Piłsudski was not admitted to the Queen for several months. He was told that because she had dismissed the majority of her household as the result of the play, Elizabeth was now unable to entertain foreign visitors. Like the king in Love's Labour's Lost, she swore out housekeeping. Piłsudski was very frustrated that he could not attend to the Tsar's great matters. He craved to see the Queen to get on with his task. However, instead of being granted an audience, Piłsudski was flattered daily with visits from high-ranking officials, from leading merchants of the Muscovy Company. He was told that Elizabeth, and I quote, "out of love for her brother and your lord and great duke, extends you great favor. She sent us to you and ordered us to take you hunting for deer in her special reserves, and she sent her very own hunters and dog masters for you." She probably wished to display her well-known skills as a huntress to make a strong impression on the Russians. In Act 4 of Love's Labour's Lost, we also have a hunting scene in which the princess, who scholars believe represents Elizabeth, princess is instructed by her forester where to stand in order to make the fairest shoot. In other words, it's a staged hunting. The princess laments for having to injure the animal more for praise than for purpose. The Russians told Alderman Barn that they couldn't go hunting that day because they were abstaining from meat. They were fasting that day. They couldn't eat the meat. So I think lamenting about injuring the animal more for praise than for purpose refers to that incident. When Piłsudski was finally invited to Windsor Castle, the attendance at this audience with the Queen was just more than impressive. The entire Muscovy Company and the whole court were in attendance. And besides the whole court indoors, over 400 people waited outside, and they're all dressed in beautiful scarlet uniforms, which was the uniform for the Muscovy Company. So in no sense could Piłsudski accuse Elizabeth of inadequate respect towards his royal master. During Piłsudski's second audience with the Queen in January 1583, the same pomp, the same processions were maintained as before. The purpose of this particular meeting was finally to discuss the delicate issue of marriage between Ivan and Lady Mary. Elizabeth said to Piłsudski that day that she loved her brother, quotation mark, referring to Ivan, and she would be very happy to be related to him by such family ties. She did, however, express certain objections, and they were not to do with the fact that Ivan wanted to marry for the 8th time, but rather his choice of bride. She thought that Ivan, who was a great appreciator of female beauty, would not be satisfied with a mediocre beauty like Lady Mary Hastings. She just thought, unfortunately, Mary just wasn't beautiful enough for him. It was known, it was documented, in fact, that Mary was considered rather pretty. But Piłsudski was not deterred by these objections, and he continued to insist on meeting Lady Mary and having her portrait painted. Elizabeth explained that Lady Mary was recovering from smallpox. Until her face was fully healed, there was no possibility that they would have her portrait painted. But whether this was true or just a ruse to keep Piłsudski at bay, we do not know. However, Love's Labour's Lost does provide a fascinating clue. Rosaline says to one of the maids of honor, "Oh, that your face was not so full of O's," referring to smallpox scars, obviously. And then the princess cuts in with the words, "a pox of that jest." If the pretense that Lady Mary had smallpox had been a joke on Piłsudski, the court would have fully appreciated it. A number of references to painting and the lack of painting in Love's Labour's Lost suggests that the remark about the pox was in fact a jest. Elizabeth successfully prevented Piłsudski from seeing Lady Mary for 7 months, but an audience finally had to take place on May 18th, 1583. A special tent-like canopy was constructed, not unlike the tent that King provided for the princess and her ladies in Love's Labour's Lost. Piłsudski was required to sit in this tent together with the 3rd Earl of Huntingdon, Lady Mary's brother. Then Lady Mary arrived. She was surrounded by young ladies and gentlemen of the court, and the meeting occurred during the day in broad daylight, so that Piłsudski might have an excellent look at her features and complexion, all in good light. In other words, they wanted to say that nothing was hidden from him that might be otherwise obscured by candlelight. In Love's Labour's Lost, Longueville questions Boyer about Maria's identity. "I beseech you a word. Who is she in the white?" "A woman sometimes, as you saw her in the light." I don't have it on the slide, but Longueville then says, "I desire her name," which, in addition to wanting to know the name of the lady, I can also see here a hint that he is interested in marrying her. So I believe this is another reference to Ivan's courtship of Lady Mary Hastings, hinting at Piłsudski's being reassured by Elizabeth that he was allowed to see Mary not in some dark room, but in the light as per Ivan's request. As we know, the play Love's Labour's Lost has so many other references to light and seeing. In contemporary English accounts, there is a reference to this meeting, but only one. This first reference to this meeting is found in the memoirs of the English envoy to Russia, Jerome Horsey. The memoir was written sometime between 1590. We know that because it's dedicated to Francis Walsingham, who died in 1590. Horsey's memoir includes a fascinating picture of this event, which enables us to see it from the English perspective. And I want you to bear it in mind that at the time Love's Labour's Lost was written, there was no published copy of Horsey's memoir. It was in manuscript form, and the first time it appeared in a printed form was in 1856, when Edward Bond, the librarian in British Library, published it. He edited it and he published it for the first time. So until middle of the 19th century, this memoir did not exist in print. Her Majesty caused that lady, Lady Mary, to be attended on with diverse great ladies and maids of honor and young noblemen, the number of each appointed, to be seen by the said ambassador, Pisemsky, in York House Garden. She, Lady Mary, put on a stately countenance accordingly. The ambassador, attended with diverse other noblemen and others, was brought before her ladyship, cast down his countenance, fell prostrate to her feet, rise, ran back from her, his face still towards her, she and the rest admiring at his manner. Said by an interpreter, it did suffice him to behold the angel he hoped should be his master's spouse, commended her angelical countenance, state, and admirable beauty. She afterwards was called by her familiar friends at court the Empress of Moscovia. Note that Longaville in Love's Labour's Lost, the same person who was told that he saw Maria in the light, wrote a love sonnet to her that begins with these words. Oh, sweet Maria, Empress of my love, where Empress of my love suggests a parody on Empress of Moscovia, which I put in bold on the left. So Shakespeare had no access to Pisemsky's report, of course. It was written in Russian and was presented to Ivan, but he seems to be familiar with Hose's account. The first of these quotations in this passage can be found in the opening of Act 5 in Love's Labour's Lost. So we meet Holofernes and Sir Nathaniel, who are returning from some kind of feast. We don't know what feast. But Holofernes, who I believe is modeled on Godunov, turns to Sir Nathaniel, who I believe is modeled on Ivan's second son, Fyodor, and says, Satis quod sufficit, which in Latin means that which suffices is enough. So it implies the proverbial enough is as good as a feast. So this quote is baffling to both Shakespeare scholars and audiences, as there is no kind of indication. What does this refer to? I mean, why does Holofernes say that? But it is almost exactly what Pisemsky said when he was observing Lady Mary. In the next scene, after we see Holofernes and Sir Nathaniel, we find the men, the courtiers, are dressing up as Russians, and they're getting ready to play Russians before the ladies. They're not aware that Boyer overhears them, and then he reports it to women that the men are practicing to speak and to walk like Russians, and they're teaching Moss, who is going to be their herald, what to do and say to look more like Russian. So the king warns Moss. He says, for, quoth the king, an angel shalt thou see, yet fear not thou, but speak audaciously. So you remember that Pisemsky compared Mary with an angel. The next two lines are also very interesting, because the boy, Moss, replies, an angel is not evil. I should have feared her had she been a devil. And so Moss obviously expects to be frightened, but why? And Hose's account also helps with that, because we remember that Hose said that the ambassador, when he was brought before her ladyship, he cast down his countenance. In other words, he fell down, fell prostrate to her feet, then rise, ran back from her, his face still towards her, and she and the rest admiring in this manner. Exactly as it was performed in Russia, Pisemsky fell down, banged his forehead on the ground before Lady Mary Hastings, and this Russian custom was performed by loyal subjects. They would do so before icons, before their masters, and before their sovereign. So a 17th century book by Adam Alearius, a German ambassador to Russia, which kind of shows Palm Sunday in the Red Square, where everyone collapses as soon as they see monarch. Anthony Jenkinson, the first ambassador to Russia, who's been to Russia 4 times, he used to note, tongue-in-cheek, that because of this constant beating of their heads against the ground and in front of icons and in front of their lords and in front of their monarch, the Russians had lumps on their foreheads the size of eggs. In Love's Labour's Lost, this custom is also treated comically, because Boyer reports to the princes that while practicing to act as Russians, the men also practice falling down. He says, with this, they all did tumble on the ground. It is easy to imagine the impression Pisimsky made by this obeisance on ladies and gentlemen of the court and on Elizabeth, because he would crash down every time Ivan's name was mentioned. And he crashed down on the floor every time he was walking around the garden, and then Lady Mary would be brought towards him many times. So he saw her sitting in a tent, and then he continued seating her while she was walking around. Every time he saw her, he would collapse. In Love's Labour's Lost, the courtiers present supposedly were admiring at Pisimsky's manner. This was diplomacy at its best. Love's Labour's Lost is much more direct, because the women heap their abuses on the men who are dressed as Russians. They deride their outright shallow shows, their badly written speeches, their ridiculous behavior. They call them fat, gross. They call them slow-witted. On the public stage, initially, that would have been a bit problematic if the audiences understood that Shakespeare was laughing at Russians. Rosaline in the play suggests to the princess that even after the men remove their habits, Russian habits, the ladies should continue mocking them. Rosaline says, good madam, if by me you'll be advised, let's mock them still, as well known as disguise. Let us complain to them, what fools were here, disguised like Muscovites in shapeless gear, and wonder what they were, and to what end their shallow shows and prologue vilely penned, and their rough carriage, so ridiculous, should be presented at our tent to us. Ivan's ardor for marriage into English royalty was only matched by the Muscovy Company's insistence on trading privileges. When it came to defending her own interests, Elizabeth did not hesitate to make demands on behalf of the Muscovy Company. It may seem strange to us that the Queen should write letters about trade to Russia, but that was the only reason she had the relationship with Russia in the first place. So her agenda with Pisimsky consisted of 3 items. Firstly, she wanted the reinstatement of the monopoly of the Muscovy Company's trade with Russia. Secondly, she wanted the right to import and export goods duty-free. And thirdly, she wanted the return of the Muscovy's use of the Russian mainland for trade with Persia, because Anthony Jenkinson was the first Englishman to travel down to the south of the Russian mainland and trying to get through to Persia. And this was allowed. The last journey that way was done in 1581, and then Ivan forbade it. So in 1582 and 83, Elizabeth was insisting on that right to use Russian mainland as a way of getting to Persia, to China. Elizabeth truly believed this was England's right, because they were the original discoverers of Russia in 1553. But in 1560s and 1570s, foreign traders were infringing on that northern route to gain the same privileges as England was getting, and Elizabeth was losing its monopoly of trade with Russia, and that angered her so much. She was demanding from them things that she expected her merchants in Moscow to get away scot-free and not to pay anything to the Russians. So Elizabeth was in a way like the princess in Love's Labour's Lost, who wanted to secure the trade for herself, but she did not want to concede anything to others. In Love's Labour's Lost, the princess says, "There's no such sport as sport by sport overthrown, to make theirs ours, and ours none but our own." And the French ambassador present in English court in late 1590s, he wrote in his memoirs that Elizabeth never conceded anything to any foreign merchants. She just wanted it all to herself. As far as the English were concerned, Ivan was an oath breaker because he refused to acknowledge England's right to the trade that they had sacrificed so much to establish and to maintain. All that cost so many lives, so much money, so much effort. And he reneged on the pledge that he made on numerous occasions to keep England as Russia's preferred trading partner. He was already admitting foreign traders into Russia, giving them harbors where they could build their warehouses. So the English were very angry at him. So it is not surprising that Love's Labour's Lost contains more words and expressions concerning oath making and breaking than any other Shakespeare plays. In fact, I counted there are over 70 expressions to do with oath breaking, oath making, oath breaking. So Elizabeth clearly had no intention of sending away very petrified Lady Mary Hastings, who begged to be spared those, I quote, dangerous honors of marrying a tyrant with a very long history of disposing of his used wives. But the ploy had to succeed, and it already succeeded in extending this drama cum comedy for many years, but now the show had to go on for one more year. Shakespeare acknowledges that the embassies were a charade. When asked by the king to have patience and to wait for the women to consent to marry them in a year's time, Biron observes, "That's too long for a play." By now, the English Navy was dependent on Russian-made rope and sails. The show had to go on. And by the end of the 1580s, a quarter of the English Navy's budget went on Russian rope alone, which contributed in no small way to the victory over the Spanish Armada in 1588. So no remedy was possible for England's loss of the monopoly of trade with Russia, except to keep the idea of a royal English-Russian marriage alive for one more year, just another year. Since the arrangements of the marriage to Lady Mary Hastings were kind of left up in the air, Elizabeth needed to place another carrot in front of Ivan's nose in the form of another English royal bride. So another envoy was sent to Russia, and his name was Jerome Bowes, who was made Sir, of course, before leaving for Russia. And he tantalized Ivan, saying that Elizabeth had 10 more unmarried relatives who fitted the bill. And Ivan said he would go to England himself. He would marry one of them there. But it was not to be, since he died while Jerome Bowes was still in Russia. And so it was up to King James to continue this careful dance with the Russians, and so he did. And Russia would be just as important to him as it was to Elizabeth. So much, in fact, that he was contemplating establishing protectorate over its northern parts. But that's another story that I would like to tell you at some other time. When Love's Labour's Lost was played on the new Stuart stage during the 1604-1605 Christmas season, James's envoy, one of the directors of the Muscovy Company, Sir Thomas Smith, was already in Russia, trying to re-establish the privileges and looking for ways to make sure Godunov's children did not marry elsewhere. But the time of troubles was already brewing. By the time Smith returned to England, it was obvious that his harrowing journey was wasted because the young Russian bridegroom, Tsarevich, was no longer alive. He was replaced by a pretender false Dmitri, a man passing himself for the youngest son of Ivan. And Ivan's seventh wife, Maria Nagaya, the one that he nearly exchanged for Lady Mary Hastings 20 years earlier. In conclusion, I hope that I managed to convince you that Love's Labour's Lost is not a fluffy comedy of manners. Rather, it is an accurate reflection of the era. I love Simon Schama's observation in his History of England, where he says that stagecraft is also statecraft. So Love's Labour's Lost to me is exactly that. It reflects the current political and economic climate. It did not need a literary source, as Shakespeare was satirizing current events. There was no need to make the plot more complex. There was a lot of going beneath the surface of the play if you knew which historical events were the subject of satire. So to Elizabeth and her court, every line of Act 5 within the mask of the Russians and within the pageant of the nine worthies, that unfortunately I don't have time to talk to you about, both of them would be loaded with meaning for Elizabeth and her courtiers, because Elizabeth, I believe, had an excellent first-hand knowledge of Russia, and so did Shakespeare, who wove it all for her. He wove it all in a kind of clever theatrical package.